Okay, yes, you're here at Ableton HQ, and a wonderful HQ it is, for a special CDR workshop as part of the celebration for Kompakt 20 years in the music scene. My name is Tony Wachiku. I'm a music producer and I run CDR, a project that is based in London, Berlin and in Copenhagen. I'm joined on the couch here with Ewan Pearson, music producer, engineer, DJ, Psychoanalyst. That's a new one, I didn't see that one.
You said on the couch, so.
Writer, all-round audio nerd, and we're here to talk a little about his approach to remixing from a creative standpoint, but also from, I guess, an evolutionary standpoint, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about. I've been doing it for a while, so
yeah,
I'm happy to talk about all aspects.
Good. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the mixes that he's worked on, something most recent, something from the past, and then we'll have a little bit of conversation about remixing per se, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay, so before we delve into the whole technical side of things, I wanted to talk a little bit about the commissioning process.
Yep.
What is it like for you?
Well, it varies. I mean, sometimes people ask me questions, and they sort of say, well, you know, how do you go about getting a remix? And they think that the process involves you going and actually going to an artist and saying, can I do a remix? And of course, it never really does work like that at all. Usually it's just somebody, I mean, when I started, it was just, I'd made my first album for Soma Records in Glasgow, and a label from Ireland called D1 just found my contact and asked me for a remix. This is back in 1998, I think, was probably the first commercial remix I did. So yeah, 15 years.
A while ago.
Yeah, a while ago. I worked it out the other day because I had to do a discography for my US visa application, and I've done 97 commercially released remixes so far, and a couple that haven't been commercially released.
One or two?
Only two.
And would you say,
maybe.
in terms of your, remixes, I mean, nowadays, are they based on, your past, or are they, a mixture of people who are a fan of your music, or the fact that you did a mix that was big, for example, successful?
Because I have this career which has lasted quite a long time. I mean, there was a time in my career when I was the, I'm trying to think of a way of putting this that doesn't sound awful. I was the person that everybody went to first, and that was for about a year. Sort of the middle of 2003 to 2004.
And was it a signature mix that?
Yeah, well, there was a mix that I did for Freeform 5 on Classic called Perspex Sex that sort of basically over the course of 7 or 8 months it was one of those records that got bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the summer of 2003, I think it was being played. I mean, people were calling me up from Ibiza, and I was kind of in my kitchen in London with the rain pouring down, and I think Damien Lazarus called me up from a toilet in DC-10 and went, listen, and I could hear my remix over the background. I'm there in my kitchen in Hackney, feeling a bit depressed, wishing I was in the Balearic Islands, and so I think Perspex X was the first one that kind of really took it to sort of the next level, and then I did a lot of different ones for Goldfrapp. It was really successful, and I did. In that year, I was offered, I think, 130 remixes in the 1 year, and I did 7. So I kind of think that I should have done the kind of old masters at work, whatever technique, where you kind of have the David Morales thing, where you have engineers and like 5 different studios running in parallel, and I could have just run between them, kind of spinning plates, like a chef overseeing a kitchen.
So why not?
Because I'm awfully prim, I guess, in the sense that I want, if you get something that has my name on it, I want to have done it. Mm-hmm. I'm a bit of a control freak as well, for me, I mean, I've used engineers occasionally for mixdowns. I use engineers when I'm producing, recording engineers, because there are people who are trained to record drum kits without getting them all out of phase and things. I know the theory, but for things like that, I'm happy to defer to an expert. But yeah, I mean, like many people with all this, I'm self-taught over a long period of time, and I just guess for me, my interest was always in having a long career, not necessarily making a lot of money in a short amount of time. So I always was very careful about the commissions I did and the remixes I picked. I was always extremely fastidious about picking things that I genuinely liked or that I felt I could do a really good job on. I mean, I turned down, I'm trying to think who I turned down. I turned down quite a lot of money from a few people actually during that period. There was a British band called Texas who offered me a 5-figure sum to remix something of theirs, and I politely declined. Just because I didn't like.
You're not feeling Texas, though.
No, and every time I did that, I could hear my sort of remix agent and manager crying over the many miles between us. At the same time, they said, we understand that, you've got this weird ethical code which says you will only remix things that you actually either kind of dig musically or think that you can do in a way that's. That works with both the original track and with what I would do with it. Another thing, I got offered a Shakira remix once, and But
that's understandable, right?
No, I was happy to do. I'd love to do a Shakira remix. It's purely on music. It's like if I can't think of a way that's going to basically please me and please the artist/label, there's really no point. Because if I can say, all right, I know that they want this kind of commercial mix, and I can do it, but that's not, people who kind of know and love my stuff would then listen to it and go, well, he's sold out, or he's he's gone for the money, or whatever. But at the same time, you also, it's a job of work, and you do also have to do something which suits the artist. I think the American A&R for Shakira thought I was a complete imbecile when I wrote back to him and said, look, I can't really think of a way to do it. And yeah, he didn't ever call back. So yeah, I could be a lot more wealthy than I am, I think, is the lesson to learn from this.
But you're happy, obviously.
I'm happy, and I can sleep at night. And no, it's the important thing for me is having a body of work that you're proud of, and it's like, there are very few, there are 2 or 3, I'd say, out of the 90 or so, that I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that one, but yeah, I don't know, it's a labour of love, as much as anything.
So I guess from the commissioning process per se, you go through the kind of pre-production process where you get sent the parts.
Yep.
Do you stipulate what you want?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of become pretty standard now in the sense that everybody sends you, essentially they send you stems that are audio bounced files that start at beat 1 of bar 1.
Not always,
Well, not always, but basically most people nowadays, they send you bounced audio stems that have been printed if it's a big act, it's usually been printed at mix stage, so it's printed with the final effects. So you could line everything up in the DAW of your choice at bar 0 and with everything at Unity, and it would sound pretty close to the final mix. Occasionally I get sessions, and occasionally I get people to send me further breakdowns of things. If I need something without effects, or if there's something I want to get at. I mean, ideally, I like to have as much access to the session as possible. And sometimes you do want to change things quite a lot. So, you want a dry version of something that somebody sent you, or you want an individual part that somebody might have sent maybe 3 stereo keyboard stems with things that aren't quite separated enough. Or for example, I did a remix of Chemical Brothers back in those the heyday of 2004, and it had Wayne Coyne from Flaming Lips singing on it, and basically they gave me a stereo stem of all the backing vocals, and they were a bit out of tune. And I'm a bit anal, so I was like, can you send me the individual backing vocals? So I basically went through the backing vocals and kind of tidied up the ones that were a bit heinous. I mean, that's probably stretching it a bit, but as I say, I mean, when you spend, I mean, I'm not a person that does these things quickly. It takes me, sometimes remixes take me 2 weeks. Okay. So it becomes like a new production in many ways, and I think that it's worth putting the time in. So quite often I'll do a little bit of extra work on the vocal if I have to. I'll do whatever needs to be done, I think, to make it sound as good as possible. So I don't, in that sense, the kind of line between remix and production, there's an amorphous sort of zone between the two. And in a minute, one of the things I'll show you, one of the remixes is probably maybe more in the kind of mode of get the parts and then get some loops and find some things that work together and what have you. And the other one is almost like a complete production. But we can talk about that.
Well, let's get to it.
All righty.
Yeah.
Okay, well...
Before we start, though, it needs a round of applause because, usually with these sessions, someone just, comes up with their laptop of choice and this mini jack out. He's actually taken his Project Studio MacBook Pro and screen from Kreuzberg to here. It's not far, but it's a big ask. So give him a round of applause for that. That's a big one. Yeah, man.
Yeah, that's why we were a bit late starting. I just did a remix for... We talk about commissioning process. Sometimes they're doing it for friends. I just did a remix for a Berlin act who are really good friends of mine called Exercise One, and it's their 10th anniversary this year. And they're doing a remix album and a compilation with some new material. So they've asked some friends of theirs to do remixes. And Marco was Marco is a really good friend of mine, so very happy to do it. It's probably the most recent remix I've done, actually. And I'll play a bit of the original track, and you can hear what I was working from.
It is happening again. It is happening. It's happening. It is happening again.
So that's about 120. I think the original was 124, 125 beats per minute. Let me just see if it's written down in here. This is the folder where everything ends up. Yeah, I can't remember. Anyway, 125, 124. And I sat down in the morning when I came to do it, and I thought, I really don't want to do a kind of 125 sort of electronic thing, because that's what they've already done. And I listened to a few of the parts, and they got some really nice synth stuff. And this sound was kind of quite triplety, and I thought, well, you feel like the beat's actually slower than it is because it's doing a cross rhythm. So I thought, let's get Ableton up. Let's see what happens if I slow their stuff down. So also I'm playing a lot as a DJ. I'm playing a lot of slower 4/4 stuff. So I'm playing as slow as 100 beats per minute sometimes. So yeah, I decided to kind of slow it down, and Ableton's for me, Ableton is, I go all the way back to version 2, and when Ableton first came out, there was this program for PC called Acid, which enabled you to do enabled you to treat audio in a kind of quick and dirty way and chop it up and slow it down in a way that no other software did. What's the American producer? It's Danger Mouse, isn't it? That did pretty much everything in Acid. Like he did the Grey album, basically mixing up Jay-Z and the Beatles entirely in Acid. So when I got Ableton version 2, I was like, oh my god, I can start doing sort of audio manipulation. And for me, it's still the best program for doing quick and dirty tempo changing, and for throwing loops and parts and things and working out really quickly what's going to work and what's not going to work. So from 125, I managed to slow it down to 95 beats per minute. And even with such a big tempo drop, it kind of worked. So let me show you.
When you time stretched it down, were you mindful of the algorithm that you used?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I use different ones for different, depending on the nature of the material. So if it has more transients, it's more percussion, I'll use the beats mode still, because it seems to protect more of the front end of the part. I'll use the Complex Pro, and the Complex Pro I'll use if I have to, for different types of sound, but they do change the sort of EQ, the sort of tonal quality of the sound. Okay. I mean, for me, I just want Ableton to spend all their money on the audio engine side of things and just keep making it better and better and better, because it's still, for me, my primary use for it. I mean, it feels like a slightly dirty admission to be sitting in Ableton offices saying I basically still use it to do to do quick and dirty sort of munching of audio primarily. But I'm here to tell the truth about my process.
There's an emotional connection to dirty and grimy.
Well, no, I mean, you know, I've done tracks entirely. I mean, you know, this remix is done pretty much entirely in Ableton. I can sequence with it. I can do MIDI stuff with it. I know I can do all these things. You can record audio into it. But I must admit, it's one of the things when we talked before today about topics we could talk about. I very much see the different doors that are available. There are things that I like about each one, and I'm happy to move between them. And I think, and I'll move between them in the course of a project. So I'll start off something in Ableton. I'll then get Logic involved. I'll bounce things out. I'll go into Pro Tools. It's quite rare for me now that I do something entirely in one platform. And for me, each of them has their fine qualities. You know, although on paper they can all do nearly everything. Obviously, because of their histories as well. You know, Pro Tools was obviously a recording replacement first and foremost. So it does now do sort of elastic audio and things like that, but it's very crude compared to what you can do with Ableton. Similarly, you know, its MIDI isn't great. I mean, I've done lots of MIDI programming on artist albums I've worked on in Pro Tools, but I don't enjoy it very much. And sometimes I'll basically bounce a 2-track recording out of Pro Tools of where we are, and then I'll stick it into Logic, and then I'll do my sequencing in Logic, bounce the stuff back in, you know, record back into Pro Tools or Logic and stick it all back into Pro Tools, or live or whatever. So here with Marco's remix, yeah, I basically just kind of sat and played with the tempo with some of the original parts, and then worked out how much I could mangle the original stuff. And it has this kind of guitar. It has these guitar parts going. This kind of fuzz guitar thing, which I really liked. So I had the idea that I'm kind of going to go for this kind of almost rocky sort of thing with a slow 4/4 and quite a heavy beat. And I, again, running with the sort of quick and dirty audio thing, I was like, okay, I looked through sort of old sample libraries I have, and I had found the old Norman Cook breakbeat CD from the 90s. Although, you know, again, I'm showing my age a bit, but so I dug that out, and I have all of that in audio on a drive. So I dug out venerable breakbeat.
Got a Barry White there.
And so yeah, the two sort of guitar-y bits from the original, these two are both from the So yeah, basically all the kind of guitar stuff I really, really liked. And there's this kind of big, what sounds like a slightly dubby kind of swell as well, which I'd thrown into a delay. Yeah, this is a 30 BPM change from the original tempo, so it's pretty radical.
That's very sort of groovy, you know. I mean, what's quite interesting is that, you know, the guitar part you've taken has got groove that the original wasn't.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, I think I love 4/4. I'm at 4/4. I'm 4/4 to the floor till I die. 4 kicks.
I think that's clear with the work you've done, definitely.
I'm 4 to the floor till I die. But I like the fact that, you know, we lived in this tyranny of sort of, for the last few years, tyranny of kind of between 120 and 126 or whatever beats per minute. And I like the fact that at the moment people are remembering that we used to do slower 4/4 stuff. And one of my first DJ and production sort of heroes and influences, probably my main one when I was starting, was Andrew Weatherall, and his early remixes for the likes of Primal Scream and My Bloody Valentine and people like that, which was slow 4/4, you know, and it had influences from people like Adrian Sherwood and the Neon New Sound. So it had double influences, and it had rock influences, and had all sorts of things. And now also with sort of, I don't know, like kind of Italo and Cosmic and things like that. So at the moment there's this kind of renaissance in stuff between 100 and 115, 116. And I like the fact that when you slow something down, the groove changes. You know, it's still 4/4.
And there's so much more space as well.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, you open up groove. So although these, I mean, this is the same part. It's not that I've edited the part or rearranged the part in any way. It's just that, for me, it now has this kind of loping, sort of dubby, rocky sort of feel to it. So, and then it's just a question of adding more stuff. I mean, it's...
Is your arrangement the same as the original, right?
Pardon?
The arrangement of the parts?
No, well, it's, well, yeah, I mean, basically that, using that guitar as the main riff, and then the Moog line comes in as well. It comes in, but now, because I've changed the tempo, it's not doing the cross rhythm anymore. It's not like doing triplets. Let's see if we can turn that up a bit. I think it's on a fade, that's right. Oh yeah, okay, I've sped it up a little bit. So this is just a big chunk of the original audio. So as I say, very much the idea to have this slightly almost hip-hoppy sort of vibe on the back of it. What else have we got from the original in there? There's a little bit of a sample, like a movie sample or something. Right at the start.
It is happening again.
I'm just going to play the whole thing for a bit.
It is happening.
There are a few things, but there's only a couple of things missing. There's one of them is I bought this AMS delay, a 1580S, which is this delay that was one of the first digital delays that much used by people like Martin Hannett and stuff from the end of the 70s. I bought it from a dealer in the States. It cost me a couple of grand, and it's an old digital delay, but it sounds amazing. And I've used it on every single thing I've done this year, so you're not hearing that. That's the only thing you're missing. But and then I kind of really like the groove. I've got the sort of the bass line and the kind of rock thing from the original, and the synths in the original as well. And I'm thinking, it's really pleasing me. It's really pleasing me. But it needs to have one more place to go. So the sort of the new bit that I did is basically coming up with this kind of this big riff. So I came up with this big sort of, basically got a big sort of melodic, kind of spacey melodic thing. And I started off on a Korg 770, which is a monophonic Korg synth that they did. I think it was the synth they did before the MS-20. Really lovely sounding synthesizer. And then kind of played the riff on that, worked the sound out on that, and then added some other things as well. I mean, I love analog stuff. Played it on a synth and this, recorded it into Ableton. But as you can see, if I use the pointer, I'm also using some doubles from sounds from Omnisphere layered under it, just to make it as huge as possible and to do some different supporting octaves. I love analog stuff. I love old stuff, but I'm not dogmatic about it. You know, I think the best records kind of combine everything. So I'll use anything. I'll use a preset. I'll use a sound from a commercially released sample CD. I don't actually give a toss about where the sound comes from.
Sounds right. Sounds right.
As long as it works.
Yeah.
I really don't. And I think sometimes you see people on forums and things like that saying, oh, you know, so-and-so used a sound from a sample CD or whatever, as if everybody created every single sound. You know, for me, picking up, you know, plugging a Telecaster into an AC30 is a preset. You know, it's what you do with it that kind of that changes it, and it's how you express yourself through it. So I have absolutely no problem with using. You know, if it works, it works. That's the only rule as far as I'm concerned. So let's have a little listen to this riff. Oh yeah, it sounds a bit weedy because it's not going through the 1580, but I'll play you what it sounds like with the AMS in a little bit. Ridiculously simple, as these things often are, but works really well with the rest. When you put it through a AMS 1580, of course. Sounds a bit weedy still here, but I'll play you how it sounds on the final track in a minute. See what else have we got here. And the only other thing is just I basically used the Moog, which I don't think happens on its own to the degree it happens in this track on the original. And because it was their original had all this kind of movement with kind of filters and stuff like that, it sounded great. Thought I'll edit that slightly and use that as a sort of a development breakdown section for the middle.
Mm-hmm. Does any processing go into, you know, when you've, you know, sent over the stems into the range view, do you just have a straight up listen and get straight into it, or do you do some processing before?
I do some 2-bus processing. So what is that? So basically on the final outputs, I have a Baxendale EQ made by a company in the States. I have a couple of different options for compression. I've got a Neve Portico compressor. I'm not sure whether this went through the Neve in the end. You never know whether it's going to work or not, so you sort of you try it. And I do occasionally use plug-in processors on the 2-bus. Not very often, but sometimes. I might sometimes use a little bit of limiting, but I'm not talking about crazy loudness limiting. That's one of my pet hates. I'm talking about like 2 dB or 2.5 dB, something to just tighten very slightly and maybe pull the upper end into focus. Occasionally I'll use multiband limiting as well, which often people say you should avoid like the plague, but if you're careful with it, again, it can be a really, really useful tool. And I have I've got 3 or 4 different outboard effects units. So I've got the AMS delay, I've got a Lexicon PCM41 delay, which is another digital delay from the early 80s. I've got an MXR flanger, the old Bucket Brigade flanger, again, another sort of 80s staple. I would buy every single delay and digital delay especially that was ever made. I love them. I love them all. I want them all. I want to own them all. I've got to buy an Ursa Major space station. That's the next thing.
Okay. Not before me though.
No, they just did a new reissue of it, which sounds really good actually.
Okay.
But I love old delays, and the early days of digital, you'd think that they were terrible machines that have been superseded now, but they sound fantastic.
Is it about the sound and the character, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. They have loads of character. They're oodles of character. And the other thing is, the AMS, for example, the analog to digital stage in it sounds beautiful. So things, although it's got this incredibly sort of low processing rate computer inside it, it sounds creamy. It's got this kind of amazing character to it. It sounds beautiful.
And are there any modern takes on these that you like?
I mean, if you need to do a quick and dirty sort of AMS style delay, the easiest thing to do is just use Soundtoys Echo Boy. Use the dual delay setting on Soundtoys Echo Boy, and then you just put different delay times into each side, which is how you program an AMS delay. You basically have to look at a chart, look at your tempo, work out what delay you want to do, and then put the appropriate milliseconds into the machine on a little keypad. So
no presets there then.
No presets at all. But but it does have memories. So if you want to do a couple of settings, and the idea was that when people were doing records and they were doing their mix down, you were using it for a vocal. Say you could have a setting for your verse, and then you could make a patch for the chorus, and you could manually trigger it at the right point, and it's glitch free, so it doesn't make any noise. So you'd never know that it had changed. So they were thinking professionally about what to do with it. The other nice thing about the AMA is it's got a pitch shift. Okay. So you could
used quite a lot, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was used a lot. I mean, I love all that stuff. I love the kind of I love the sort of Martin Hannett Joy Division drum sound where he's got all this kind of metallic effects on snares and things. That was all made with the AMS. AMS is all over vocal production from like 80s pop records. Things like just doing a tiny little bit of pitch shifting, going down on one side, going up on the other, and providing a little bit of sort of chorus spread. Yeah, so it's a fantastic machine.
Question.
Yes.
Do you ever use Scene View at all? Scene
View? You mean little box view?
Yeah, little box.
As I like to call it.
Session View.
Yeah, I mean, when I start, I kind of bung things in there, and then I'll make scenes. I'll sort of jam it out, and I'll use capture and create scene, and then I'll basically organise a load of scenes in an order, and then usually the way I do the arrangement is I'll play it down, trigger scenes live into an arrangement, and then I'll edit the arrangement, and then I'll go in and sort of get them more busy with sort of edits and stuff. Yeah. This one actually looks ridiculously straightforward, but that's basically because some of the movement and stuff is happening from things like feedback on the AMS delay, so I'm riding the feedback on the delay and doing effects like that. So certain amounts of non-linear things which make the sort of block arrangements less blocky. But when I got to the end, I don't know, I had about 2 or 3 goes at mixing it and couldn't really get it right. I heard it too many times, so I went. I was away for a couple of weeks, and then I came back. And as I often do, although you can mix down perfectly well in Ableton, and there are remixes I've done, like my remix of Foals was done entirely in Ableton and mixed in Ableton. Because psychologically, the process for me, there is a kind of a break when it comes from, I try to mix as I go. I try to get things sounding as good as possible as I go. But for me, then the mix process, it's quite often a good idea to have a little break as well, so that you come back to it fresh. So
have a different connection to
if you can afford a couple of days of not doing it, and then you come back to do the mix, it's always a good idea. But the other thing that I do, and I do this a lot these days, is I move out of the DAW that I'm working in. So if I've been working in Logic, or Ableton, or a combination of the both, because I use them a lot, rewired together. Rewire is one of the best things ever created, as far as I'm concerned. And if only Apple would be sensible enough to let Logic be a slave rewired to other things, it would be brilliant. But don't get me started on the state of Logic, because I'll rant. I'll rant for
another
a long
session,
time.
mate, another session.
Yeah, so basically, bounce all the audio out of Ableton and throw it into Pro Tools. Let me just get this Pro Tools session up.
At this point, has anyone got any pressing questions they'd like to ask?
Yes.
Yes.
Just I wanted to see how you make your other three kick lights.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And maybe you can show short how you did that.
Yeah, let me just... I mean, they're just basically two different kicks, one of which is, I think it's a processed 808. Yeah, it's an 808, but that's actually taken from, I think that's taken from a multi-track of another thing I've done, so it's already been processed a little bit. You can hear a little bit of noise on it. And then there's that, which is softer, which is providing a little bit of a slightly different frequency on top, and a little bit of space, like it's coming through a bit of reverb. Not sure what that is, actually. But when I came to the mix, one of the things that was making it hard for me to mix is I think that the tuning on one of the kicks felt a bit weird, and I just wasn't happy with the kind of EQ of the kick. And for me, it's the most important thing in dance music, and it's always, sometimes always the most annoyingly difficult. I can come up with melodies, I can come up with a million other things really easily, but it's the fundamentals sometimes, it's the foundation stuff. Yeah, and if you don't have the right kick sound and you don't have the right tuning and things that are sort of complementary in terms of EQ and stuff, it doesn't matter what you put on it, your mix is still going to sound weird at the end.
What's interesting for me is the fact that, for a lot of your mixes, obviously the 4-to-floor, the kick is important, but it's also quite subtle. It's not, for a lot of producers, the kick drum way up there in the mix, whereas for you it's quite a subtle.
Yeah, it sounds pretty, I don't know, sounds pretty loud when it's been mastered. But I don't know,
That's like not thuddy, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's not,
there's always the issue of, the other sort of thorny question for those of us doing dance music is the kind of, is kick-bass relationship. Does the bass go above the kick? Does the kick, which one goes up and which one goes down? That's in terms of EQ, and position in the mix. That's always tricky, and that, I've certainly been guilty in the last few years of thinking that as my mix skills got better, I could just sort everything out with EQ. And you just can't, It's like, I'd sort of be like, well, that's fine, because I can just, I've got really good at EQing things. And of course, sometimes it's just about the quality of your original stuff. So it's basically, I'm certainly guilty at times of kind of thinking I can make anything into anything else. And it just a simple change, deciding that actually it just needs a new kick sound. Sure. And you've sorted your mix out in 10 minutes. Whereas previously you could spend hours fiddling with different plugins and trying different stuff. So I just bounced the audio out of Ableton, trimmed off the blank stuff, and I really, really, really love UAD for the stuff they're enabling us to do with their modelling of a lot of stuff. So this had the new Pultec suite, which they've just released. The Pultecs had just come
EQs,
out.
right? Mm.
Yeah. So that's all over this.
And couldn't you have done this in Ableton?
Yeah, I could have done, but as I said, the idea that you're, in some ways, you're clearing the decks, and also it's a bit like, for those of you that have worked on analog mixers,
so zero in the desk.
It's like zero in the desk,
sure.
It's like you bounce the stuff out of Ableton, and then you come into a new session, everything's on zero. So then the adjustments you make are smaller.
So is this like going from, an SSL desk to a Neve desk, for example. I mean, you know. So when you transferred the session across, did you keep the levels up, or did you just literally bring the mix up from the start?
I think I pulled the level. I think I pulled all the mix levels down a bit because I wanted to leave some headroom. So I think I tend to bring everything down to something like -6. And then I have a pretty sort of regular way of doing things, which is if I'm doing production stuff for people, I'll submix in Pro Tools. So I'll have a drum bus, a bass bus, a guitar bus, a keyboard bus, an effects bus, a lead vocal bus, and a backing vocal bus. So everything will be bussed out to those individual buses, and then it will go to the whichever outputs they need to go to. I mean, that's useful partly from gain staging point of view. It's also useful because sometimes you want to put something. Sometimes I might have a couple of drum buses, so I might have a kind of dry drum bus and then a compressed drum bus. So I'll do parallel processing and stuff and decide which to send. I mean, again, with digital, we're given so many options in terms of how we route things and how we organise things. It's sometimes overwhelming. So yeah, I mean, it basically threw it into Pro Tools and started again. You know, with thinking just about tone and sound and what do I need to do to get it a little bit tighter. So things like gating and triggering. Basically, I decided I needed an extra trigger, so I added this this other kick with a little bit of hi-hat or something on top of it. What else am I doing? Not sure what I'm doing there, just choosing the gain. Pultec, doing the classic Pultec trick, which is to boost and attenuate around the same frequency at the same time, because the characteristics of the boost and the attenuation are different, so you end up getting this kind of a really nice peak shape. Yeah, and then just basically start again and put my mix head on and forget about the fact that I made the remix and just start thinking like a mix engineer and how can I make it tighter. And some filtering and stuff. So there's this DMG plugin called Equality, which I really like for doing sort of corrective EQ and for fixing stuff. Oh, it's the Pultec again. What else? This is peaking a bit, and when I was mixing this, I was summing through individual outputs and bussing a bit more, so that some of these are getting more things through them than they would be normally, which is why you're seeing so many red lights. I try to be a bit more grown up about this sort of thing normally. I don't mind the occasional red light, to be honest. If I can't hear it distorting, then I don't worry if the DAW's telling me it is. But at the same time, gain staging is such an important thing, especially in digital. It's kind of, and especially with the sort of artist production and mixing that I do, that sort of stuff becomes really important. I used Pro Tools to mix in some of my MXR flanger, which is just basically hardwired to a 192 interface, which connects to Pro Tools. Similarly with the PCM41, so you're not going to hear those things in this. And yeah, things like what's that? That's the return from the PCM41. I sent through this kind of fluttery pan effect. Yeah, a little bit of fake SSL style compression on one of the outputs, basically, that's doing most of the drums, just to tighten up the kicks a little bit, really, and to bring some stuff forward. So as I said, I'm not averse to using I'm not averse to using plugins for doing compression and things like that. At the moment, I still think that EQ is winning in the DAW, and compression hasn't quite caught up yet.
Okay.
I think it's brilliant EQs now. I think
Even as far as UAD is concerned?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I used the Teletronics that they just brought out. I quite like, and the new 1176s I quite like. But ultimately, having been fortunate enough to use hardware compressors and some very nice hardware compressors, when I've been doing sort of paying jobs for other people, I still prefer, if I could do it, compression and stuff all outboard, I would. But EQing, I think, is getting amazing, and now you've got a choice between your surgical EQs, the ones that don't really do anything to the color, and you've got some really nice EQs now that actually either emulate older stuff, and certainly have sort of deliberately color and affect the sound, which I really like. I'm going to swap over to another thing to show you.
Before we do that,
go on.
Was it a question about this particular remix, or? And we've got a question over there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you come up with the arrangement, like how much time you spend. Do you kind of have an idea before you start listening to the track, or you just kind of like put all the stems in and then start fooling around?
It tends to be sort of building it, like I was saying about the scene. If I'm doing it in Ableton, for example, the thing I was saying about using the clip mode and building up scenes, and then starting to organize scenes, and you sort of play around with that for a little while, and then you think what I tend to do is I tend to sort of add things, and at a certain point I think, have I got enough? And then what I'll do is start making an arrangement, and usually find that I've got about 70% of what I need, and then I'll need to do some more stuff. But I think there are times when I have a very clear idea there might be a very clear idea I have about the arrangement, and there are times when I'll sort of jam it out. And that's one of the nice things about Ableton, actually, is that you can get your clip view, and you can set up some little bits that you like, and then you can play it, stick it into record mode, and sort of play it, jam into it a little bit, and then you can do your arranging on the fly, and then you can tighten it up afterwards. But there's no fixed format. It's always different, basically. I do a lot of remixes which are song-based or vocal-based. I think one of the reasons why maybe I've got a career at all is that I did a lot of remixes for people, sort of 2003, 2004, which were vocals and stuff, and I used the whole of the song. I didn't do... A lot of people at the time were doing remixes where they'd use like a little snippet of something, or a fart or a belch from the original song, and then they basically make a new track and stick a little bit of the original into the new track. And
I guess your version came in the kind of alternative radio version, I guess.
Yeah. Or for me, I didn't really realise I was doing it. A friend of mine, Philip Sherburne, pointed it out to me, that I was basically doing what the sort of post-disco remix kind of from the 80s, the sort of extended mix that people like, I don't know, Shep Pettibone and Arthur Baker and people like that. When remixing started, you couldn't do as much in terms of adding new stuff, and it was very much about doing just enough to make the track work in a club. It wasn't about necessarily creating a whole new track yourself. And I certainly, maybe one of the reasons when I was talking about earlier about only choosing things that I really like, a lot of the original, and maybe that's because I also kind of veer towards the idea of doing a remix that represents what's good about the original, sure. And you add just enough. I mean, it's not just me being lazy, because I still do a lot of work in the process.
How we can clearly see that.
But I can show you...
Before we do that, I had one question over there.
Yes, I was wondering if you always thought that hardware delays sounded better than delay plugins.
No, I mean, I've always used, I'm a big fan of the Logic tape delay. I'm a big fan of Soundtoys. Echo Boy, I think, is superb. I'm a big fan of just the filter delay. I use the filter delay in Ableton a lot. So for convenience sake and for throwing things up quickly, I use delays all the time, and I used never to use reverb. I mean, I used to always use delays and things rather than reverb. I've learned to use reverb at the last few years. But so delays have always been a big part. But what I like about hardware delays, again, is it's the same thing I like about using synthesizers. Part of it is the interface, the fact that you're working with something a different way, in a hands-on way, and you work in it. I mean, with the best will in the world, although you can ride a feedback on a slider on a plugin, it's not the best way of, I think, of interfacing with a machine. And I am frankly probably a bit lazy and a bit impatient when it comes to setting up some kind of external controller that has pots and sliders and stuff. I have a little Euphonics 8-channel thing, which you can, in theory, map to the characteristics of plugins, but I don't ever use it to do that. That's either their fault or my fault or both of our faults, but I tend to think it's both of our faults. But I had piano lessons as a kid, and yeah, a bit of cello when I was very young. But yeah, I mean, not that much more than most people. I mean, the great thing about all this stuff is that if you've got an ear, if you can hear it, and you've got some patience, you can usually work it out. So, I do a lot of my sequencing in the computer and a lot of things, step time and stuff. And I've been getting into modular synthesizers recently, and buying a few of the Eurorack things, which are kind of peculiar sequencers. So I really like the Make Noise Rene and the Tip Top Z8000 as well. And I've got like quantizer and stuff. So I did a remix, which I can't show you today, for Jessie Ware, which I did about a year ago. And like basically all the bass lines and the main riffs were all coming from modular stuff and were sequenced from modular, which was brilliant, but it took me ages because every day I'd go into the studio, I'd be absolutely terrified that it wasn't going to sound the same, because I didn't want to print any of the audio until I'd actually finished the arrangement. So rather than, I basically had this modular set up with these sort of 3 patches for 5 days, I think. And one day I went in and it didn't sound right, and the Rene had dropped its settings, and I had to kind of get it back. But it's
all good memories.
It's not. I mean, it's computers are much more convenient and brilliant, but as everybody knows, I'm sure, sometimes you want to close down your options as well, and you want to force yourself into slightly more tricky situations. Anyway, what I've got now is a remix I've just done for Andy Meacham from the UK, who was part of a group called Bizarre Inc. Yeah, Andy Meacham, who was part of the sort of UK rave group Bizarre Inc., who had a massive hit in the UK called Playing with Knives. And in the last few years, he's been making music as Emperor Machine, and he uses a lot of outboard stuff. He shares this studio in Stoke with this guy who's kind of, I think he's just this sort of synth obsessive who's got like huge Roland modulars of all kinds. He's got the most amazing setup ever. This guy is like, I don't know, some kind of Tangerine Dream head fan or whatever. And seriously, if you go on Facebook and look at, go to the Emperor Machine page on Facebook, have a look at some of the pictures. If you love synthesizers, you'll have to change your trousers, because it's really amazing, really amazing. And he asked me to do a remix for him, and so I was like, oh shit, because he's not only is he really good, but he's got all this amazing stuff. I'm trying to see if I've got the original. Okay, Emperor Machine, hey. Okay, so this is Andy's original. This isn't quite finished, I don't think, this version. So this is not the final mix down, so forgive him that. But yeah, this is kind of very like slightly no-wavy sounding, sort of punk-funky sort of sounding disco thing. And it's got a vocal, which his stuff usually doesn't have. So I listened to that and I thought, well, I really like the song, and it's got all these amazing parts, and if we had time, I could play the whole track down. You'd see there's loads of great synth stuff. And whereas with Marco's and Ingo's track, the Exercise 1 track, the thought was that, because it's primarily instrumental, maybe don't want to do it at the same tempo, want to put it into a different space in terms of genre, and use lots of their stuff and kind of give it this different feel, take it into this kind of dubby sort of space rock territory. The idea with this was just like, you've got loads of really good stuff. What would you want to do to make this a little bit more insistent and a bit more to play in a club? And so it started off as being about that, and it just kind of grew and grew. So let me just pull up Logic. I even mixed this with somebody else because there was so much stuff happening and I'd heard it so much. This is why it's color-coded here as well, because I'm basically trying to organize the session. Because when I mix for other people and they send me sessions which are in a terrible state, I get really, really grumpy, because it usually takes me like 2 or 3 hours just to sort it all out at the beginning. So I try to have good practice in terms of being methodical about how I organize my sessions. It's a really good idea to do this. I mean, OCD issues aside, just from the point of view, if you just organise things and put them in the same place each time, it just makes things so much easier.
Do you have particular order in terms of grouping, so drums first?
Yeah, but definitely.
Bass,
so the sort of the ultramarine stuff here, the green stuff here is all drum stuff, and then you've got bass, which is this green. We've got a load of different synths. There's some guitars. There's a lot of different spot synth stuff. I've got some saxophone, and you didn't hear any saxophone on the original because there isn't any saxophone in the original. I can't play saxophone, but I'm really fortunate in that I did once produce a band with a really fucking great saxophone player in it, Gabe Andruzzi from The Rapture, and he's a good friend of mine, and I called him up and said, can I send you this track? See if you like it. If you like it, could you play some sax on it for me? And he didn't do anything for a couple of weeks, and I thought nothing was going to happen, and then it arrived. And he just sent me basically like 4 or 5 takes of him just playing. So it was a bit like, I mean, in the sense of producing, I still then had to go in and do. You might think, oh, it's great, you can call up Gabe from The Rapture and he'll get him to play saxophone on it for you, but I still had to do quite a lot of work. Because you've still got to organise stuff and basically pick all the best bits and make it into a track. And that's the only problem with distance working. You know, if I'd been with him, I'd have been able to say, I really like that riff, let's go back and get that again. How about trying something like this for the start? I'd be there and producing him. But rather than, I mean, you suppose we could have done something over Skype or whatever, but I don't think that would have worked really well. So I'll play you a bit of the sax as well. And the sax ended up being a really big part of the track because I really liked the vocal, but I felt the vocal could have do with my producer head on. I was thinking, well, what would I do if I was in the studio with them? I'd be like trying to think of ways that we had things which played off the song, because the song is great, but there's not so much of it. So the sax does a little bit of sort of call and response stuff with the vocal, and it plays off some of the riffs. And the other thing I did was think, I want it to be slightly heavier, and although Andy's got all these amazing synthesizers, I also want to put analog synthesizers on an Andy Meacham track, because I'm basically that kind of idiot. So
it's a battle of sine waves then, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, I will bring out my modular synth. So I started with the modular stuff, and I have a relatively small modular setup, just a couple of rows. This, I think, is... I'm trying to remember what was the oscillator, and I can't, for modular heads. Forgive me. It was the filter on it is that new make noise filter, the Vactrol filter, the MM... I can't remember what it's called, MM something. But it does a really nice sort of acidy sound. So basically, yeah, the first thing I did was try and work on just a little riff part, bass line, riff, whatever. Well, it's not a bass line, but kind of... So when I was doing the remix, I basically got this little riff, and then did it like 3 or 4 times, changing the characteristics of the sound, and just recorded it in. What I was saying before about the Jessie Ware remix and keeping everything playing live until the last minute, because I was doing more harmonic changes. There were kind of chord changes and stuff, and I wanted to have the arrangement absolutely nailed before I committed. Whereas with this, that's why it's called modular scratch. It was very much, I'm going to make this little riff thing, I'm going to play it down, jam it a little bit, so as you can hear it it opens up. And then once you've recorded in this big swathe of audio, it says ABC, I think there was a D as well. It's then a question of like hacking at it, editing it, and making it into a part. Yeah, sure. I think that way is how most people tend to do their analog stuff. You know, recording it in, and then arranging
Capturing
it.
performance, isn't it?
And then arranging it as audio. Yeah. I also like being able to have that control and being able to change the arrangement. But that requires quite a lot of patience and a little bit of nerve. But the machines are going to keep their sound.
Was the track playing while you were...
Yeah, well, I basically just got a kick and a couple of things going. So the hats are from, I think the hats are from the original track. The SH7 clap is also... there were so many brilliant parts in this track that it was a kind of joy to do, but... And the idea was very much trying to make something... I kind of wanted to make something that almost could have been released in kind of in that weird hinterland, sort of after disco and before house. It reminds me... There's a little bit of soft cell memorabilia going on in there, and there's sort of... So the riff part is basically doubled by a low bass. It's a little bit boomy in here, so it's hard to hear. And I had all of this for ages and really liking it, but it still needed this extra thing, and I was a little bit lost. And so I got Omnisphere out in the middle of this kind of analog wonderland of beautiful old synthesizers recorded and stuff. I got Omnisphere and found this really nice little sort of funk line thing, patch thing, which really added the sort of final element that I needed in terms of the sort of groove. So yeah, in the middle of this, analog synth nerdery, there's a plugin, sounding great, doing exactly what it needs to do. So again, Dogma can go hang. It's like you need, use what you need, and you can find it from any source. And then it's just a question of gradually adding in things from Andy's original. So that's kind of where I sort of built up in terms of drums and my modular and synth plug-in stuff, and then deploying lots of Andy's stuff. Didn't use all of it, but kind of reorganized it slightly, dropping things in. So there's lots of little events. The fact that it's essentially one riff for, and no chord changes for nearly 10 minutes. With something like this, doesn't matter because you're adding so much detail and so many events, and it has that kind of, it's quite lively. So, this minimal post-minimal house. This ain't. And we'll go to the saxophone for a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Now the saxophone I also had going through the AMS, so let me just phone bus 2. I put in an Echo Boy, and I was talking earlier on about how if you wanted to make an AMS delay or something that would do something a little bit like that on the cheap, Echo Boy could do it. This is how you do it. Here's one I made earlier, as they say. You just use the dual echo setting on Echo Boy, and then dial in the amount you need. And I've basically got that across the whole sax bus. And when we did the final mix down, I was riding the feedback and stuff like that on my AMS delay live as we were putting it down. So
recording or MIDI automation?
No, I did it me.
Okay.
Human being every time.
Human
I did it the
preset.
same every time.
Okay.
I think about 8 times.
Okay.
Because we were recording it to tape as well. The guy I mixed down with, Hannes Bieger, who has this amazing studio here in Berlin with a lot of really lovely analog stuff and desks and what have you. He's got a very nicely set up reel-to-reel tape machine, and we thought it might suit this track, and it really did. So we did it all to tape. So I had to basically recreate the same or similar moves each time. Again, the live element is kind of part of what makes it fun. So I'll play you a little bit of the saxophone. Gabe loves his kind of out, sort of weird sax as well. So I got all this very strange kind of, circular breathing stuff and all this sort of thing. So I'm kind of layering it up. Made this kind of quite peculiar intro. And then I was riding the AMS delay, not quite the same sound on this, but you get the idea. And then just doing a bit of EQ with the API. Just on the saxophone bus, but we basically took that off and did it with real stuff in Hannes' studio and put it through a really lovely compressor as well. So it's just production here. It's just like listen to the stuff he plays, pick out the bits that are good. So like the little kind of rhythmic stab stuff.
This atmosphere's a vulture for a weak mind. This atmosphere's a vulture for a weak mind.
Quite minimal processing, really. I mean, the vocal was really nicely recorded, so basically, I even EQ'd it. I must have EQ'd it. Maybe I didn't. Okay. Oh yeah, maybe just a little bit of pulling out the bottom end and just a bit of compression and a little another AMS but recorded into Altiverb, a little bit of their ambient setting. So yeah, I mean it's as I say, from then on it's just production stuff. It's all about listening to the parts, seeing what sounds good, deploying it in the arrangement. And it's nice because he'd come up with some stuff which played off the little riffs and things, so... Now, if I'd been mixing it at the same time as I was doing this, you'd see a lot more automation. But because I knew I was mixing it with somebody else, there was no point in starting to do the automation until it had got its correct compression and EQ and stuff.
And also, I guess you can go into your kind of mixer head on that stage.
Yeah, so basically I left that to that stage. So on the final one, there's a lot more rides in terms of the dynamics of the sax. Yeah, and then... I'm trying to think, what else? Is there anything of note? Is there anything that anybody thinks that they'd just like to know what that is? Or,
yeah. Any pressing questions?
I'm looking at it.
That's just a no scratch.
Yes.
Go for it.
Do you always mix out of the box, or do you sometimes do stuff only in the computer?
It's both, is the sort of simple answer. I've started to do more. I mean, I would love to go and mix everything with Hannes because he's got about 100 grand's worth of really beautiful stuff. But I can't afford to do that, and I don't have the time to do that a lot of the time. So what I tend to do is I always do some processing externally on the two bus, so there'll be some equalization and often some compression done out of the box. Nowadays as well, I've got a few more of these effects. There's some external effects. But what I do now is I've got a metric halo interface with very nice converters. And even with that, what I do is I make basically 4 stereo buses. So it's a kind of a variation on, I don't know if you know, there's an American mix engineer called Michael Brow, who's famous for developing this kind of mix technique where he'd basically, rather than having 1 stereo bus, he'd have like 4 stereo buses. And he'd basically have different compressors and settings on each one. And then he'd just decide as he's mixing what instruments to throw out to each one. So you can kind of do, it's a bit of a sort of poor man's version of that really. So I might have, there's some things like the Metric Halo does some nice kind of valve and transformer simulation. So you can do that. And then I've got the limited things I have, like the effects and the EQ and stuff like that. Like I might have compression on one stereo pair, for example, and then have EQ on the whole track. So basically, I come out with 4. These days, I come out with 4 stereo outputs from the computer, and then they're summed. I have a mixer, a line mixer, which is made by Spec in America, which I used to just use for all my synths. So basically, all the synths would come in on the Spec. Sounds really good. It's very low noise, low distortion. Line mixer, it's 32 channel, it's just a single rack unit. And you have 16 pots, and it's basically like 16 stereo things, and you can have the mono if you want. But it sounds so good, you can essentially use it as a summing mixer if you want. And I sat there for several hours with my studio partner and stuff, and we sat there and did comparisons and stuff. And it's subtle, but I like it feels like I'm getting slightly more in the top end. It feels like I'm getting it slightly wider stereo image. But that aside, what it also gives me is fewer problems with gain structure. Like I can throw more stuff out of the mixer at higher levels. So because you have to be so careful with gain structure in the DAW if you're just going to a stereo channel, because it becomes a nightmare. Whenever I'm mixing, I try really hard to pull everything down at the start, so that I'm not hitting things too hard later on. But by 2/3 through the process or 3/4 through the process, I'm always too loud. And then I always have to put, it's then a massive pain in the arse to pull everything down, especially if you've been automating along the way and you've started to do stuff. You've then got to really carefully get all your things lowered. So, yeah, I would like to have more sort of summing happening externally, if it's just for the gain structure and for the ease of being able to plug in external stuff. But for convenience sake, mixing in the box is great. I just mixed, at the start of this year, I mixed 9 tracks out for this band from Sydney called Jaguar Ma of their album. Just a mix job, and a bit of programming, but mostly mixing. And I did that in the box, but in Pro Tools. So, as I say, with that, some of the tracks were going out to an external compressor. Everything was getting some analog EQ and some effects, but it was summed in the box. So, again, I'm not dogmatic about it. If you go to Gear Sluts or forums, you'll see people arguing and, arguing for months about whether this is better, and people saying, well, no, digital's summing, saying that the math says that, it must be perfect and whatever. But I think there are practical reasons why if you can do it, it can be useful. I think those practical reasons these days are to do with things like gain structure and the ability to plug in other analog stuff easily. I think with my DJ ears, which are probably a bit battered at this stage, maybe my ability to hear the other differences is less than some people's.
Continue to hear. Any other questions?
Like when you take your stuff out of Ableton to mix in Pro Tools or Logic, there's loads of render settings. What have you found works best for?
My render settings are just that I render at 24-bit. I render as much bit rate as I possibly can. And I will render, if things are stereo, then sometimes I'll take the time to work out if things are actually stereo or if they're just mono on 2 channels, and then I'll send some things mono and just reduce the amount of load on Pro Tools. But that's less of a problem these days than it used to be. And I don't ever do any normalization or anything like that. I basically just get stuff out at the same levels that it's in the track, and then I import it into Pro Tools and pull all the faders down a little bit so I give myself a little bit of room, and then start from there.
Thank you.
I think could they also work with different programs, Rewire? I'm working with Cubase.
Yeah, Rewire is really good.
Everything, just select my scene in Ableton, then I take them to Cubase.
Yeah. No, I mean, I rewire Ableton, I rewire to Pro Tools all the time when I'm producing and working with bands and stuff like that, and we want to do some programming, or we want to throw some stuff in. Very often I'll just rewire Ableton to Tools. Because when I'm working with bands and recording people and stuff like that, I always use Pro Tools because it was designed originally as a tape machine. It's by far the easiest thing to operate in that department. It was the last DAW that I learned how to use, and it was the quickest for me, and it was the simplest to learn. Logic is the one I've been using the longest, and Logic was still the hardest to learn. Ableton I found pretty fast to pick up. But yeah, I rewire Ableton to Logic all the time as well. I probably at this stage I probably had a few things in Ableton and then bounced them in because I was prepping it to be mixed with somebody else. So I wasn't going to take an Ableton session and a Logic session, and trying to sort of organise everything and be a bit considerate of my my mix engineer. You can see a couple of rewire buses there. So I definitely had Ableton rewired in at some point. As I said, I wish Apple would let Logic be a rewire slave as well. But as I said earlier, I wish a lot of things about Logic that I probably don't want to say in public.
Another session. Any pressing questions? Go for it.
I saw you use different track delays on Ableton. how do you use it? Do you just do it by ear, which sounds good?
Just by ear, yeah. I mean, it's in Logic, you know, you can do that. You could always do the sort of track delay forward and backwards. I mean, for me, it's just about slipping audio again. It's about groove. You know, it's just about getting the feel of what works against something else. When you rewire it, though, delay doesn't work. So that's one of the reasons sometimes to say start in one, bounce out as audio, because then you've got the sort of offsets between the tracks. Everything's about groove, you know. I mean, when I started, I was working on an Atari ST sequencer, like on Creator, which is the forerunner of Logic, and you know, MIDI being incredibly, everything being done with MIDI. I mean, when I did my first remixes, you know, you talk about the commissioning process and how delivery. I used to get the parts on a DAT, and the DAT would be what's called a timecode DAT. So the DAT would have SMPT timecode on the left-hand channel, and then it would have a part on the right-hand channel, and then you basically had to have a timecode reader built into your sequencer, and you used to have to play it and record it in, so you'd build up your multi-track. Before that, I used to have to basically if I wanted to do a vocal remix, I used to sample every line of the vocal into my Akai sampler, and then I'd trigger it. So it would take me 2 days to put vocal onto a track, because you're trying to adjust timing and stuff. I mean, it's, you know, it does make me sound like an old bastard, but I am 41, but I mean, going back to sort of my early 20s.
A seasoned bastard.
A seasoned bastard, yeah. That might be my new Twitter bio. Ewan Pearson, seasoned bastard. But yeah, no, I mean, it used to take 2 days. I mean, it used to take so long to do. But, so things have improved, definitely.
Cool. Okay, so I think we've got to wrap it, otherwise you're not going to end up DJing, mate. No?
I DJ all the time.
We want to hear DJ, right? Even if it's like 15 minutes. You know.
Okay.
Ewan Pearson, thank you very, very much indeed for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
But before we just wrap up, how can people get hold of you? What's your, where are you online?
I am, I'm on Twitter, Ewan Pearson. I'm quite an active Twitterer. I'm on Facebook as well. I'm a bit less active than I should be on Facebook, I guess. And I'm on SoundCloud as well, so you can get me all of those places.
Thank you very much indeed.